Hi, my name is Alyson Dodd, and I'm going to be talking to you about our paper on measuring wellbeing in a student population. So firstly, this wasn't research in the traditional sense. We took on the somewhat significant task of looking for any paper, any research paper that had measured student wellbeing in some way, shape or form, and to pull that together, to draw out some conclusions and to make some recommendations for the sector moving forward. And that's important because there are lots of different measures of wellbeing, and that's typically using questionnaires, asking about current state of wellbeing, and we wanted to know what questionnaires are being used. And in terms of defining wellbeing, well, that's really important as well because it means lots of different things. There are lots of different theories about what wellbeing is and the components that make up wellbeing. And that can be anything from feeling good and feeling happy, life satisfaction, to feeling fulfilled with your life goals, with your sense of purpose, your relationships, and so on. So it means a lot of different things, and that should inform how it's measured. This was against the backdrop of increasing numbers of students reporting difficulties with mental health and wellbeing, and with the publication of the University Mental Health Charter. So the Charter supports a whole university approach to mental health and wellbeing in the entire university community. And to test if those approaches work and to understand the factors and circumstances that improve or have a negative impact on student mental health and wellbeing, we need to have confidence in the measures that we're using. And what we found when we looked at what was already out there was that wellbeing wasn't being defined by most studies. They said, oh, we're investigating student wellbeing, we want to support student wellbeing, but they didn't tell us what they meant by that. And as we've seen, that means a lot of different things. There are also 28 separate published measures used across these research projects. And that's important because they're all claiming that they're measuring the same thing. They're all saying that they're measuring student wellbeing, but those measures actually look at quite different facets of wellbeing. Some of them looked at mental health symptoms, which I'll get to later. Some studies also developed their own tailor-made, bespoke one-off questionnaires, which is good on one hand because it's about the student context, but on the other hand, you can't compare with other projects, and also they've not been tested out before to see if they measure what they're supposed to measure, and all of those steps you're supposed to go to with measure development. And when we look at measure development as well, most of the questionnaires that had been used had not been developed for use in students. They've been developed for use in the general population or in other specific groups. But here they were being used in students and they hadn't necessarily been tested out in students before. So our key recommendation was that the sector should move towards an agreed set of measures of wellbeing for use in students. We discourage the creation of bespoke one-off measures, but at the same time think that measures of wellbeing specific to the student context are really important. And ideally, those new measures should be developed with students in the first place. At the very least, existing measures, which we do need to use for multiple reasons, should be tested in students to make sure they measure what they're intended to measure, that they make sense to students and that they feel relevant to them, because that will mean that they can complete them openly and honestly, and they will just make sense to them when they're answering those questions. To evaluate whole university approaches, it's also worth going beyond individual wellbeing, which is what these questionnaires typically look at. So community wellbeing is about being well together, and it lends itself really well to the whole university approach. And the components that make up community wellbeing, you can see them through the themes that come out in the University Mental Health Charter, and it's things like the strength of social connections in the community, the ability to form and sustain community, the physical environment and how this facilitates connection, and cultural factors as well, such as effective leadership, being able to speak up and make change, and having equitable access to resources as well. So we basically suggest that people put time and thought into measuring wellbeing and to what measure they actually select. Make sure it's actually assessing what you want to assess. And when it comes to mental health symptoms, we question if those that were developed in clinical settings are appropriate for use for understanding whole university approaches. So the Charter itself defines mental health problems as emotional and/or psychological distress that's difficult to manage and goes beyond usual experience up to and including mental illness. And not all students will experience those types of clinical symptoms. So well-being measures may be more appropriate for use in whole university approaches, whereas if you're actually wanting to look at mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, then of course those clinical measures would come into play. So this was the very first step in understanding how we should measure wellbeing in students, and there's a lot of work to be done, and we did do some work alongside this on speaking to staff and students about their priorities for wellbeing measurement, and that was as part of the Smarten network. So it's worth taking a look at that report in tandem with our review.